Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am excited to be here today. I see that we have some attendees still joining in, so I'm going to give it probably another 30 seconds or so while we have everybody kind of settle down on the attendee list. I should ask Mike, we should have prepared for this, but do you have any good dad jokes or anything that you can bring up while we wait?
Oh man.
I should have prepared you.
You should have. That was a. I'm gonna play the. I'm a relatively new dad, so I don't have jokes accumulated yet.
Nice. Do you have little ones or a little one? Nice. Good for you. Congratulations. So.
Thanks.
All right. Actually, it's been about a minute here anyway, and I think the attendee list is coming down. So it's not coming down. It's settling off, I should say. So a couple things that I want to talk about. Excited to be here doing another MSP Blastoff. We are talking about identity access management, which I think is an extremely relevant topic today. When Violet and I were talking, Violet is typically the host, but we've got her locked in a dungeon this week. So unfortunately for her, she's working hard, but that means you get me as the host this week. But when she and I were talking, we felt that with all of the issues that were going on in the world today around ransomware and phishing and all this fun stuff, identity access management is really, really important. Whether you're using SAML, SSO, two-factor authentication, right? There's different means of logging into systems nowadays that I'm going to say you must be using. But what was interesting is when I started talking to Mike at Evo, we learned a lot about sometimes why I would say SSO is just not enough in what they're doing. So before I move on to the introductions, let me do a little housekeeping item here. Let me switch to my slide. And then, yeah, good, a transition. So our MSP Blastoff is really a thought leadership series that we do, sponsored by Domotes. What we want to do, whether you're a service provider, an integrator, dealing in the commercial space, the residential space, we're really trying to provide you with things that are useful to you. Hopefully, maybe a relevant topic going on in the industry, or it may be some tips and tricks based off of industry experts and what they've dealt with. And I'm really excited to bring Mike into this to talk about identity access management like we talked about, because it's so relevant to today. As a formal introduction, my name's JB Fowler. I'm our Chief Product Officer here at Domotes. I'm joined with Mike Roth from Evo Security. Mike, I'm going to let you do an intro before we get into the slides here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so thanks, JB. My name, is Mike Roth. I'm the CEO and founder of Evo Security. We've been around now for almost 3 years. The first couple of years were just really spent doing a ton of market research, talking with MSPs, really trying to understand their pain points with respect to identity and access management. And through that, we learned so much, and we're able to start really building a purpose-built solution around what do MSPs need and what do their customers need. So it's been a really amazing journey so far. We've built a fantastic team, and we're an earlier stage company, but we're really growing fast and earning the trust of a lot of our partners.
So Mike, it's interesting you say you're early stage, which is true. The company's fairly new, but when you and I were talking before, I actually found out your background has been with identity and cybersecurity in some sense for quite a while. Can you speak? I don't know if you can say some of the things you've done on a webinar, but touch on a little bit of the interesting aspects of what you've done before you started Evo.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a degreed engineer by background, and throughout my engineering career, I was mainly working on industrial systems, and I was learning that, wow, we have so much of the data that's being transmitted through industrial processes, and it's all going back to kind of the mothership network. And a lot of that seemed very loosely secured to me. And I started to develop this passion for identity and for access, because it seemed that, a multi-billion-dollar company that had data sort of loosely floating around didn't really make a whole lot of sense when that data was used to actually really help that company grow, and it's what was reported publicly and stuff like that. So that was really what sort of clued me into identity as being a pretty big, and access as being a pretty big issue. And then later, I was actually an institutional investor where I rolled my engineering experience into starting a private equity firm. And it was a mid-market firm. And I also learned that the same data was going into bank data rooms that was protected by password 123 kind of stuff. And it was just really shocking to me, and it really opened up my eyes. So many years ago, before LastPass and 1Password and those types of solutions were around, I was designing those and trying to figure out how can I build a product, and Evo was sort of the manifestation of that.
It's awesome. It's awesome. I love the background. Perfect guy for the job, perfect guy really for this MSP Blastoff and talking about this. And I think we're going to give some examples. So we've got a lot to talk about. With that being said, let me move on to the title slide, if you will. I am going to preface this because you and I spoke before. I looked at these slides, and I actually love the slides that you and your team put together here. So I want you to present. You tell me when to move the slide forward. And then if you don't mind, I'm going to ask questions along the way or bring up relevant points that I think may be pertinent to the conversation. So is that okay?
Yeah, sounds great. Let's do it.
Good. All right. You want me to move on yet?
No. So this one, I think this is really important to understand. And this is kind of our mantra, is that, we're protecting livelihoods, but we're doing that, against the most common and the most destructive form of cyber attack. I think you'll read headlines about these big, attacks that target, large enterprises, the Colonial Pipeline. We've heard of that recently. But what's not being reported is all of the small attacks and kind of the medium-sized attacks that are happening all day, every day. And in aggregate, those are extremely destructive for any small business or mid-market company's livelihood, and they're extremely common. And what happens is it's usually the function of a credential breach. And so that's what identity and access management is for, is to eliminate that attack surface in a very unified and effective way, and really shut all that down. So
yeah, I can fully appreciate that. In fact, I know you're going to go through some examples here, but one of the things that I just learned this morning is there are platforms out there that can do like phishing simulations and things like that for companies. And I found out that some of the phishing schemes are so good that even experts from these companies that are creating these simulations fall victim to outside phishing schemes. Well, yeah. I bring this up because with identity access management and the things you're going to talk about, those are going to be ways in which you can help mitigate those risks. So I find this so relevant today that even experts are fooled. And if they have this level of, protection in place, that it really helps. So.
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah, it's all part of social engineering, which we'll touch on here in a sec. Yeah. So yeah, for this slide here, I really just wanted to just provide a landscape of what we're seeing is going on in the world. And I think, establishing that baseline is important. About 10, 15 years ago, everyone thought that, hacking was this sort of Ocean's 11 style situation where, there's this one person in a basement, and, they're really doing this incredibly sophisticated, hacking. That, of course,
still as good as George Clooney, right?
That's right. Yeah, that stuff is still going on every day. Don't get me wrong. And, nation states are attacking other nation states. But what's also happened is that hacking has become a business. There are people like you and I, or, high schoolers, all the way up to, really doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, but you could actually go online, find tools to start hacking, in the same way that you can go online and figure out how to build a website. So a lot of it is automated, it's software, it becomes really easy. So the hacking today, especially for the SMB and the mid-market, has become kind of the common thief that would go around a parking lot, just kind of looking to see, you know, who left their door unlocked. And so what we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, that a lot of attacks, I mean, are up well over 600% at this point. And they're smart, you know, they know that everyone's now remote, and they have so therefore their attack vectors and opportunities have increased. And what we're seeing is about half of that activity is targeting the SMB, which becomes really relevant for the MSP, right? And what we're also seeing is almost 90% of all of those attacks have something to do with a login breach or a credential breach. And so that really makes identity and thinking about identity and access really important. And ultimately, you know, the end goal for one of these hackers is kind of oh, go ahead.
Yeah, when you say a login breach or a credential breach, you're really referring to the fact that either somebody used too simple of a password and the hackers were able to, I'm going to say, crack it, or there could have been some social engineering aspect where the user just gave away their credentials unbeknownst to them. Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, it could be. And actually, the social engineering method is where more success is, but the low-hanging fruit would be the password 1, 2, 3s and those, or someone using the same password for multiple things. So yeah, those are the two primary methods, and they can get really sophisticated, but those are the two main ones. But you know, with either of those, I mean, their ultimate goal is they want to hold you for ransom, right? And what used to be, you know, on average around a $10,000 payout is now up to, you know, almost $250,000. So that's where also, if you think about as an MSP, you're thinking about, well, gosh, like, can my customer afford to wake up on Monday and be held for ransom for $250,000? Probably not.
Yeah.
So, and if they are, then, you know, they're doing great. It's still a problem.
These guys, it seems that they're getting a lot smarter about this ransomware thing too, because, you know, they may go to a large hospital, right? And this has been in the news just within the last few months, but, you know, a hospital gets victimized or becomes a victim of ransomware. And rather than asking for the potential millions of dollars, they actually ask for, you know, low 5-figure numbers, which for them, it almost becomes, yeah, it's just easier to pay that out than to try to deal with all the other, you know, potential aspects. So yeah, they're getting smarter about how they do this.
They really are. And that's why, you know, my aha moment, you know, a couple of years ago was that, you know, this has become actually a really good business. It's not a great business.
We're not promoting that.
Absolutely not promoting that, but it's if you think about it, I mean, the success rate is really high, and it doesn't require that much work for somebody who's nefarious like that. So, but it's unfortunate for the good guys, right?
Yeah. So. In fact, I think the next couple slides show how they do this, right?
Yeah, and you know, there's plenty of ways, but I wanted to, you know, just put some of the two primary methods that are most common when it comes to credentials and logins and stuff like that. But method one here, basically, I'm going to work you from left to right and then down around the bottom there. But one thing that a hacker can do is they can go and on the deep or dark web, and they can, you know, like I said, buy some tools and have some automated bots that they can just pummel your login. And, you know, sometimes it'll get caught, and, you know, the DDoS will get caught before something like that really happens. But inevitably, they're going to pop the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit I was mentioning before, the password 1, 2, 3s, or I'll show you, actually, it's pretty shocking. Even if you have a relatively long, complex password, they could actually crack it pretty easily. And so they're finding the easy targets. They're going to say, hey, look, I'm in your system now, whether it was your network or whatever application. They say, hey, look, if you want this back, then you're going to have to pay me. And that's one thing I wanted to make clear, is that hackers today, they're smart. They know it's not about like what you have, but it's about what you would pay to get back what you've lost. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't think as a small to medium business that, oh, you know, I'm too small, they don't really, you know, need a whole lot, then that's not how they're thinking. They're thinking that, hey, look, you want your livelihood back, you want your business back, then you're going to have to pay up for it. So this is the first method. They're just using automated tools and bots. And then the next method
Yeah.
is, this is where a lot of the success and a lot of the headlines you'll hear about. And this is called social engineering. So basically, they'll say, hey, look, there's let's move on to the non-easy targets, or sometimes they are easy targets. And let's send, a spoof email, or we'll send a text message or something that would force you to click on a link that allows the hacker or the cyber criminal, which is really what they are, they're criminals, the cyber criminal, to steal your credentials and then gain access to whether it's your network or an application. And then it's the same process. They'll demand Bitcoin, typically, is what they'll do, and hold you for ransom. So social engineering is actually, on a percentage basis, the largest and most successful form of hacking right now today in the world.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and you hear that with the headlines. I mean, they don't talk about the exact details of what happened, but when you read into the post, when you start to read in and understand what's going on, yeah, it was about, I'm going to say, mismanagement of passwords or credentials in some way. So
yeah, and it's really hard too. I mean, yeah, that's where education comes into play, and really, and other systems too. Identity and access management is one of many solutions you should have for a healthy security posture. But ultimately, go ahead.
Those points you're making. I mean, I was excited to have those slides, which I think probably the listeners of this, of this podcast, they understand this term social engineering, and I think we put up these slides to say, hey, this is the basis of what we're talking about. And in some sense, we see it as a duh moment, yeah, and this is simple. But the reality is there's still a heck of a lot of small, medium businesses. There's a lot of MSPs. There's even a lot of vendors within the MSPs that maybe are not using these types of tools. And yeah, again, when Violet and I were looking at how can we bring awareness about this problem to MSP Blastoff, I mean, you guys kind of shined here. And I hope now people understand that, okay, yeah, this is important. Now you're going to talk about what do we do about this, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a huge problem. And I think enterprise, like the enterprise level, they really understand it. And identity and access management has been a huge business at the enterprise level. But as the attack surface has moved down to the SMB, which it's done really rapidly over the last 3 to 5 years, it's now time to start, developing a level of consciousness as well at that level around how to have the same level of protection that the enterprise does, and really start to reframe your thinking. So it's super important. I would argue that it's probably in the same category as, like, a firewall and antivirus. IAM to me has entered that space, but I also run an IAM company, so there's that.
I look, as a vendor in the space, right? Domos, we take security very seriously, especially being a cloud-based service, right? That's really important that we manage that appropriately. I'm not necessarily in the IAM business, but I also am a fundamental believer in this. The more I've learned about it, because it's just a way to not only protect your company, it protects yourself and it protects your clients, right? Or your customers out there. So
that's right. Yeah, and speaking of customers, I mean, this is usually what you're going to find, this sort of siloed, disparate setup where you have users who have devices, and then you're managing a network, and then you have web applications, and not all of these things are unified, right? And each one, some web applications might be able to use SAML, which is a standardized authentication protocol that allows a company like Evo or others to actually connect to those web apps. Sometimes they don't offer MFA at all, and sometimes they do, but not SAML. So there's some struggles there, but everything else that that you see here, what you want is you want to have it unified. You want to have some level of control over, who is entering, and when they do enter, what are they allowed to do, whether that's a user or a machine, and what are they allowed to do after they do enter. So most small to medium businesses, this is all disparate and dislocated. And what it effectively does is it provides multiple attack vectors for a cyber criminal, and they could kind of pick and choose where they want to try and crack first, and then they'll move over laterally to another. Maybe they start at your application and then they move to your network, or maybe they start with a device and then move over to an application and then the network. Or they start with a network. It gives them some choices. And what you're effectively doing too is you're sort of trusting your employees to manage their own security, which is not really that great an idea.
So that brings up an interesting point, because you were talking about the enterprise versus the SMB, and there's no doubt in my mind that enterprises for the longest time, I mean, for a decade or two since I've been working in enterprises, they've controlled your password. They've said when you need to change it. They've said, here's the access you get, and here's the access you don't get. The interesting thing with small, medium businesses, and I think MSPs in general, is that rather than having the IT department be the controller of passwords, they've really let the users. And that's kind of dangerous nowadays, especially to my point earlier about phishing and how these guys have gotten really good at that. You're putting a lot of trust in your employees. So anything you can do to remove that, I think, is, I don't want to say a best practice, but you got to minimize risk in some way with respect to this.
Yeah, that's actually a great teaser. We'll talk about zero trust here in a second. Phenomenal point. And a really good one to understand.
I was just building ahead of the slides, wasn't I? That's what you're telling me.
No, actually, I thought it was a good carrot to dangle. That was great. Yeah, so I mean, really, just building off the last one. I mean, when you do implement an identity and access management solution, you really are putting your business in a position of strength to try and shut down as much of the social engineering, the bots, and cyber criminals from being effective, because you've now unified all these disparate parts of your IT infrastructure, and you've taken the security out of the hands of the employees of your SMB, and now the MSP is the one who is in control of and has a visibility across the landscape of what they have. And so, I think it's important here to mention that in the past, what I've seen is that everyone thinks that, we'll just sprinkle some MFA over here and we're good. But MFA, SSO, privileged access management, something we do called elevated access, and then soon to be password management. Those are all point solutions in a broader IAM platform, which is what our focus is. So I think, starting to think holistically about this, green circle here is really kind of where things need to go, instead of just a point solution here and there.
Well, and I think you're going to talk about this. I don't mean to be dangling more carrots, I guess, but you guys are finding intelligent ways to remove the I'm going to say the burden, that risk from the employee back into a more complete ecosystem. So I'm excited. I think people that are listening to this will be intrigued by what you're going to show here. So let's see.
Great.
The next slide shocked me, and I have to say, Mike, it actually has forced me to change some passwords.
Good. It's working. Yeah, I mean, this was shocking to me too. The first time I saw this, I actually couldn't believe it, and I started doing more research and actually realized that a cyber criminal, I mean, you can go buy a GPU right now, like 2 or 3 GPUs, and they're not really that cheap, but you can do it. But a single cyber criminal with 2 or 3 GPUs can actually crack billions of passwords with a B per second. like billions per second.
That's fascinating. So not only are GPUs being used for Bitcoin mining, but now
right.
they're being used for password hacking as well. It's
Correct.
incredible.
Yep. And what it is pretty shocking to see that with tooling like that, you could, even if you have a 8-character uppercase, lowercase letter symbols, within one day, if they really want to crack your password, they can do it. And then once you get into kind of that yellow orange category there at the bottom, where it starts to show months or years, that's usually where they'll kick it on over to the social engineering methodology if they really want in. So yeah, it's pretty shocking. And so when you do have identity access management with respect to credentials and passwords and that sort of thing, you really shut that down. It gives you the best chance of doing that. Now, if some nation state comes in with this massively sophisticated thing that nobody's ever seen before, well, then I'll leave that as like a caveat. But by and large, what you're protecting against is going to get shut down.
Well, and I like this slide too, because it's not an either or type of thing. You don't use a simple password with identity access management or whatever. You should be using both, right, to get the most secure for today's day and age when where we are, get the most secure access.
Yeah, and what's really interesting too is we've talked to a bunch of like white hat hackers and pen testers and stuff, and usually they say, hey, look, when we encounter a system that's locked down really, really well, that has MFA or SSO, we usually just kind of move on. And hackers do the same thing. If it's too hard for them, especially at the SMB or the mid-market level where they're looking for easy wins, they'll move on. So, as an MSP, you're thinking, well, gosh, how can I protect my own legal liability? I don't want my customers to sue me or something like that. I mean, having an identity-driven strategy becomes, really kind of a no-brainer.
It's funny, you see this on Ring doorbell camera footage. So you see people walking up to a driveway, they check the door handles on the car. If they're locked, they'll move on. If it's not locked, right, they'll get in there and they'll scramble through and take whatever they feel like they need. So it's the same concept.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a perfect example. Yeah, that's great.
Well, this slide I found extremely interesting as well, and this is where you start to talk about some of the uniqueness of what Evo does. But I think for the MSP audience, this is extremely relevant, right? Or any, I'm going to say any integrator, any service provider that is dealing with multiple clients in this scenario. This is intriguing. So please.
Yeah. So this was also another thing that was sort of shocking as we were launching our company. And what we learned was that, MSPs and MSSPs are unique and they have this one-to-many relationship. I think that's pretty easy to understand. But when you start thinking about identity and how important that is, and credentials and how sensitive that information is, you want to make sure that you have full partitioning between your customers, because if one customer is breached or something bad happens, you can't move laterally over and then hit the next customer, right? And that becomes a big rat's nest for an MSP. And a lot of the enterprise identity solutions out there, they're built for exactly that, the enterprise, and therefore they're contemplated to have a single database where the users are separated by a schema. Mm-hmm. And so as we looked across the landscape, we realized, that makes me nervous for an MSP, because they need to, I mean, if something bad happens and there's a lawsuit or something against them, then we really need to make sure this stuff is partitioned out top to bottom. And so every tenant is partitioned out, and even the directories that get synced up into those tenants are partitioned out. There's 2 layers of encryption in transit at rest. So, a fully, well-architected, well-engineered foundation. And it kind of goes back to zero trust as you think about that conceptually. And basically what zero trust means, in the way that we view it, is I think the future of security and zero trust is identity driven. I think that's And the reason for that is, devices come and go, users come and go, nodes in a network come and go. All these things can come and go, but the connective tissue to all of those is an identity. And so when you think about zero trust, it's basically saying, hey, I don't trust any machine or any user at all that's trying to get into my stuff. And therefore, they need to validate and prove to me that they are who they say they are. And that's where the MFA and the SSO piece comes in. And then once they're in, I'm going to still not trust them, because I'm only going to give them access to the things that they should have access to, least privilege. And therefore, now I'm protected across the outside and the inside. So it's less about building a giant wall with moats and stuff, and more about, hey, look, just because they get through the fence or through the gate doesn't mean that we now should trust them. And so that's what zero trust means. And I think identity is the core foundation of zero trust. And I think multi-tenancy for the MSP is really what just taking that a step further and kind of fusing those two concepts together. So this is actually really fun to engineer, and it turned out really well for us. So
to me, this makes a lot of sense. And if I had to, I guess, kind of recap some things that I think are interesting here. First is kind of around the zero trust aspect. We're assuming that an MSP has multiple clients and customers. Like you said, they're not an enterprise IT department. They actually have companies that know nothing about each other. And because of that, to your point about trust, you can't assume that one company is going to follow all the rules and best practices. Therefore, they should absolutely be segregated from any of your other clients. And other solutions may not do that as well as the architecture that you guys have built here. Is that safe to say as a recap of what this slide shows?
It is, yes, absolutely. Okay. Yep, nailed it.
So this is more of a question, okay? And I'm saying this really as Domotz and as a vendor that's out there to MSPs. The service provider is using lots of different tools, right? Lots of different services in order to build their business, and they're picking from the best of breed or what meets their needs for their clients. I think the question I want to ask you is, you may implement identity access management, you may implement SAML and 2FA or MFA. How important is choosing a service or a tool that implements or can implement SAML that you guys can build on in order to help this whole thing work? Does that question make sense? Do you kind of understand where I'm going? It's really more of a vendor-based question, I think.
Yeah, I think I got you. I mean, basically, there are lots of different standardized authentication protocols out there. So SAML's one, OpenID Connect is one, Radius, which has been around for quite a while. That's another one, and OAuth, which is actually kind of a built on top of OpenID, which is where things are kind of headed. But those are all standardized, and what we're seeing is that some applications, different vendors, they recognize the importance of centralizing identity and making it streamlined to manage, because when it's disparate and sort of a fragmented process, then that creates gaps and kind of puts you at risk as the person responsible for configuring all this stuff on behalf of your customers. And so some vendors have done a really nice job where they've added a SAML capability or OpenID Connect capability, but others have not. So, it's still not a perfect process, but I think the notion, how we work together here recently with Domotz to put the little Evo radio button, on the login, just to make it really easy. It should be a simple process. I think trying to centralize and unify all that is it's still an ongoing effort. Yeah.
If you had to, you were definitely touching on my question. I guess where I was thinking is, as a service provider, you need to be cognizant of the tools you're using. And if they don't implement some of this more advanced, authentication methods like we're talking about, then you need to look at that as, is this a risk, right? Or should I maybe migrate to another service where they actually implement this? My thought process on this would be yes. I mean, and the tools we use at Domos, for instance, we make sure that we can leverage the identity access management or multi-factor authentication, so that way we keep our customers secure. Do you have any thoughts on a percentage of a number of maybe services out there that use this advanced stuff versus don't?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I would say, man, shot in the dark, it's probably 50-50.
Is that right?
Yeah, maybe more. What we are seeing a lot of SaaS applications really start to implement SAML.
Yeah.
So I think it's getting better there for sure.
I would agree with you, and that brings up an interesting point too, which I'm sure you guys can manage this, but a cloud-based service, I have no doubt in my mind that if you're dealing with the cloud, there's a really, really good chance that you're implementing these more advanced authentications. But if you're an on-premise solution, it's probably just about username and password and the IT department or the service provider saying, okay, here's your login, and that's about it. Because these on-premise solutions may not get upgraded as often, and they may not have, at least 2FA or something like that built in.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's your cloud infrastructure and your on-prem infrastructure, and we actually do reach out to on-prem infrastructure as well. So so it's unifying all of that stuff.
And that's a nice thing about this architecture. In fact, is that this next slide, which is around, I think, elevated access, does that speak to some of that?
It does, yeah. It's all part of it. This was really an interesting, as we were exploring early days, this was another thing that was really interesting and sort of shocking to me, was that, for years now, a lot of MSPs have been doing the best they can. I mean, when they have a customer that says, hey, we're not going to give you, you might have 10 or 20 technicians, in your company, we're not going to pay to have, one email per tech, and that way they can log in, because then that's a management nightmare for us. What happens if one of them leaves? Then they still have access to our stuff. And so usually what will happen is there'll be like, 1 or 2 or 3 or sometimes more administrative accounts. And so as soon as you deploy in an enterprise identity solution, is also the very same second that you're forcing the MSP to have these interesting workarounds on how they're managing security on behalf of their customer. And it actually puts them in a fairly liable situation. And I didn't like that. And so what we decided to do was figure out, okay, we've seen sometimes people have used like another product where you can dump some passwords in a bucket, and then everybody goes and kind of grabs that password, or maybe people are sharing MFA codes around on Slack channels or Teams channels, or we saw one that was really sophisticated. It's actually pretty smart, where there were websites set up with webcams, and people had their phones with rolling TOTPs that all technicians would log into, but there was really not an option. So they're, like I said, they're just kind of doing the best they could. And so what we decided was that, look, this is the way things are going right now, and from a liability standpoint, and then also things like HIPAA. HIPAA clearly states as part of guidelines, like you can't share passwords and codes. It's just, so if something were to come back, that's probably not good. So what we decided to do is say, hey, look, the easiest way to engineer this is just let the technician log in as themselves, where they get a push notification to their own phone, and they just log in straight into that customer's network. And if they leave, they're shut out. They don't even ever need to know the password, really ever, because we will just take care of that for them. So we just identified that as a really big problem that needed to be solved once and for all. And we're able to do that. So we're actually really looking forward to rolling this out.
So seeing this, I don't know if you're familiar with a change we made within the last several months, but Domot's originally, we had charged for seats. So the number of, you pointed out email addresses, right? And people paying for it. We kind of did the same thing. And we internally looked at how that was being used. And what you found is service providers, integrators, they were coming up with a, common email address and then, a password that gets shared about. And we realized that that was actually quite, well, it's just not a secure method. And right. we said, okay, enough with that. We're not charging for seats anymore. Any standard users that's out there, if you have 10 employees, give them 10 unique logins, right? Use their email addresses as the login and have unique passwords. And I think that was the right decision to make because of this. So okay, I'm glad we're on the right path with the way you're thinking. The other comment that I wanted to make, you bring up HIPAA, which is absolutely right. Not they have processes in place to make sure you're not sharing passwords or sharing user logins. I will tell any service provider or integrator as well that if you're dealing with companies that require SOC, require CMMC, require NIST or CIST or all these other let's call them security process frameworks, they're going to have that same requirement, which is you need to have a unique login for each user that's out there. And leveraging something like Evo or some other SAML SSO based tool helps you but helps you implement that properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That was, early on, when we were launching the company, we NIST, actually a really interesting quick backstory about Evo is that as a means to accelerate our go-to-market early days, we actually approached what is the world's leading commercially available supercomputing center. We're based in Texas, and so they're actually in Austin. And we went to them because we realized that they were trying to solve similar problems. It's interesting, there were so many companies that were logging in to use their compute resources from all over the world, governments, NASA, things like that. And they were sort of functioning like an IT shop. They had an entire room just sort of functioning like an MSP. And we realized, man, there are just so many, in this one-to-many relationship, there are so many things that emerge that still need to be solved. And so yeah, as we got kicked off, that's actually we were hatched out of that supercomputing center as well. That pretty neat little backstory. But and NIST was a really important part of the protocols that they follow. So as we launched Evo early days and started doing our engineering work, that was really what we tried to follow as well.
I noticed just while we're on that, and then we'll get to the next slide. But speaking of NIST, I've noticed that it's been over several years, if not a decade, they've kind of changed the guidelines on how you handle passwords. I mean, it used to be X number of characters with symbols and all that, and you have to change it regularly. And it seems like now what they're saying is when we force people to change it often, it actually leads them to, putting it on a sticky note or something here. And that's actually worse from a social engineering, or they write it down versus try to memorize it. And they've made some changes to that. And I think leveraging, these types of tools like you guys have here is one reason that has allowed them to make some of these adjustments. Is that a true statement?
It is true, yeah. And I think that's where password managers really started to make their way in the industry and stuff. But yeah, I think the way to think about identity and access management is you're sort of fusing together the concepts of the password manager, the MFA, the SSO, and then privileged access management. It's all of those things coming together. So I would say that IAM is more like if you were to take the entire NIST document and try and follow all those, and you just need like one place to go, that's IAM in a nutshell, instead of like kind of picking pieces off. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I'm gonna go to the next slide because this is one of the last like kind of meaty slides. One thing I do want to comment. We're leaving time on purpose to answer some questions. I see a couple of questions that have come in, but if you guys do have questions about some of the things we've talked about or said here, by all means, ask away in the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel, and then we'll get to some of those at the end. Sorry for an interruption there, Mike, but
no, that sounds great. Yeah, and we're an open book. I mean, whether it's during or after, anything that we can do to help the community, that's what we're here for. Yeah, I think this one's really easy. It's just, you know, what does all this mean in practical terms? I think today, the unfortunate and inconvenient truth is the fact that it's not if, but when. I mean, for real, that's sort of where we are. And, you know, I'm not really that big of a fan of fear tactics, but I am a big fan of, you know, rationale and just understanding like what's real and what isn't. And this is real. So, you know, we made this cool little hacker guy over here that says not today. So that's how we want to help. So yeah, that's where things are today.
I think this is such a valid statement, and you're right. It's like a lot of people like fear-based selling, but you don't need to be afraid of this. I mean, you can see that it's really happening. It's out there today, and it's happening at a large scale government enterprise level. But to your point, it's also about the small medium businesses, because those are the easy wins for people. And you know, I wanted to bring awareness to not only all of our customers, but anybody that's listening to this, that if you're a service provider and you're dealing with clients, I don't want you to be the one that puts not only your own company, but even your clients at risk. And these are great tools to help mitigate that risk. So I think it's such an important aspect. I certainly wanted to give you a little bit of time to talk about Evo in general, which, you know, a lot of that has been come in here. But while we're getting some of the questions in here, let me move to the next slide here. And you can kind of speak to the value proposition and how you guys do that. And then I'll start to look at what questions we're getting here and writing these down, and then we'll go to that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple for us. I mean, you know, the only thing that we do is we build identity and access management for the MSP. We do not sell to the enterprise, but what we are trying to build is an enterprise grade solution that is just super simple. It needs to be, you know, really easy to configure and manage. It needs to align with the ways that MSPs think and want to manage their customers. It needs to integrate with their tech stack. It needs to be really cost effective. Yeah, at the end of the day, it needs to help and not just be like another thing in your dashboard fatigue on a daily basis, right? So that's our goal, and it's been really exciting to work with Donuts and others that see the value in what we're trying to do here and how we're trying to uplift the MSP community.
Yeah, you know, you said something there, which it's on the last bullet, help me help you.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of make a comment, which has been, I think that MSPs get pushback from their clients when the service provider says, hey, if you're gonna work with me, you need to be implementing these tools, right? You need to do MFA, you need to do OAuth, SAML, whatever, right? You need to use Evo. You know, the clients sometimes get frustrated with that. And, you know, my response, and I know this is easy to say, but it's like, if you're going to have a client that's pushing back on, you know, you protecting them, it's probably a client you don't want. But that being said, you're also pointing out that by using some of these tools, you're actually making it easier for them. What's your thoughts on that when people push back on this?
Yeah, I have one just like business thought, just going back to my, you know, investor days, where I mean, the easiest thing to do is then to just make them sign a waiver of liability that says, hey, look, I've recommended this this to you and it doesn't seem like something you're interested in, but here are the benefits. I'm going to spell them out for you, and here are the risks that you're taking. And so I think from a business standpoint, that's what I would do. But also, yeah, I mean, what we're building here at Evo is that our whole goal is to actually provide additional value to the MSP, so that you know, one of the things that they can then relay back to their customers is say, hey, look, like, here's this solution or this tool that's going to make it dramatically more simplistic for me to actually manage your security. So actually there's value on both sides of the table here. Like, otherwise you're making it harder for me to manage your security. And then that has its own inherent risk, right? Like, because now I'm spending more time worrying about more things, and they're different locations. And so yeah, it's kind of like a win-win across the board, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that. In fact, this next slide, I want to get to that, and then we'll do the questions. I view this as such an important thing, and we normally on the MSP blastoffs, you know, it's not about product placement and positioning, but I think this is such an important thing that, you know, we work together to do this discount for somebody to try Evo, which I really appreciate that, Mike, because I want all of the Domot's customers, even if you're not a Domot's customer, I want you guys to consider security and you know, making sure that you minimize risk when it comes to access management of the tools you guys use and your customers use. Do you want to speak to this, and then we'll get to questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, we have the benefit of being you know, where we are today in our company's life cycle to offer some pretty great discounts. At this point, yeah, we just want to help as many MSPs as possible. And yeah, so we're doing 20% off. Just say, you know, Domot's 20. You can actually just go right on our website and just sign up, just schedule a 15, 30-minute or a 60-minute, you know, just discovery call or demo, whatever you prefer, and just mention this. Or you can reach out to us, you know, at sales@evosecurity.com. And anybody that wants to contact me direct, I'm happy to provide my information too, if they just want to have a phone call and talk. So anything we can do to help.
Good. So, and I'll put this last slide up. I'm going to leave this up here while we've got we got like 6 or so questions here that we'll try to get to. We have about, I'm looking at the time, 8 minutes left, so we should get to some of these. The first question, which I love, it actually happened at the very beginning. We get this all the time. It is this being recorded? The answer is yes, absolutely. We recognize that not everybody can attend exactly when we're broadcasting this, so we record these. We will make it available on our channels. I know the Domot's channel will have it. We'll have it through some of our you know, social media partners as well. And then Mike, I assume you guys will probably link to it in an email or on your system too. So that was a simple question. That was a nice, easy one. You know, there's a question. I think this came probably from one of our Domot's customers that were asking about this, but they're essentially asking how can Evo make their network more secure? So I imagine this is a customer that is using Domot's for, you know, network monitoring, the network management, you know, dealing with their wireless access points, the infrastructure. How does Evo fit into that?
Yeah, so basically anywhere you have an access point into your network is where we can live and do MFA/SSO. So there's lots of ways you can do that, but if you need to set up, we have a self-hosted radius server, so we don't force you to configure that or, you know, host that yourself and have to deal with it. So we'll host it. We'll provide you with the, you know, the information that you need to then go and input on your side. We also have a really simple MSI package. You just download it, install it. It takes like, you know, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, something like that to configure. And you know, yeah, basically anywhere you have an access point in your network, even if you have like jump boxes and other things like that, we can live there and provide that layer of protection. It's pretty simple.
So I'm going to give a little bit of let's call it a teaser out there. I mean, and probably it's a question to folks too. So make sure you jot down the support@domotes.com and sales@evosecurity.com emails. But, Mike, you and I have been talking for several months now. And, one of the questions that always comes up from the Domotes side is, oh, okay, Domotes, you discover all these devices, you allow this remote connectivity into these devices, but each of these devices has their own unique password out there or login. How can we simplify that? And I know there's password management tools and things like that. I bring this up as a teaser to say, you and I, Mike, are recognizing that this is a problem. And I think we're thinking about how can we help
Yeah.
simplify this? How can we use, identity access management like we're talking about to mitigate all those passwords and logins into these products? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most exciting things we're getting into now, and which was initiated by our conversations over the last several months, like you said. And yeah, I think we've built a really amazing foundation that's highly secure in order to build upon and offer those types of capabilities, centralizing, streamlining, making it easier for the MSP to use, integrating deeply with Domotes.
Mm-hmm.
All those types of things I think are coming. So we're excited about it.
So we got another question here that I think is interesting, and it has to do with yeah, and I have to apologize. I may not be familiar with these companies, but it says, is Evo Security similar to what you see with ThreatLocker or Auto Elevate? Are you familiar with those services or those tools, and what's your thoughts on that? Okay.
Yeah, so I think the best way to think about Evo is if you were to take the best parts of like Duo, Okta, um, LastPass, Thycotic, CyberArk, and then certainly some parts of Auto Elevate, some parts of ThreatLocker, although I'm not as deeply in tune with everything that ThreatLocker is doing, and combine that all into one solution. The birth child of that would be Evo. So some of what Auto Elevate does today, we do as well, especially on the machine side, of course. And yeah, so I think that's the way to think about it. So it's a way of consolidating all of the solutions into one.
I think it's interesting. I mean, you said at the very beginning. I mean, Evo is a relatively new company. I mean, you guys founded it 3 years ago, I think you said. And of course, you've also had a pandemic in your way. But I think that what that's done is it's given you guys time to look at all these solutions that are out there, take the best of breed of what they've created and build that into a single solution, which I think is part of what makes you guys kind of awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we're pumped. We're going to go to market in early 2020, and then with the pandemic and everything, we said, you know what, let's just wait, see what happens, but use this time to just build and just as much as we possibly can. And so, as we've gone to market here over the last 8 months or so, as we have these conversations with different MSPs, they say, wow, this is really cool. What if we did this, this, and this too? It's like, oh yeah, exactly. That's where we're going. And so, yeah, 100% of what we build at this point is just all based on feedback.
Good.
Yeah.
I mentioned this before, but I don't necessarily like this to be too salesy of a webinar by any means, but we got a question. I think it's because you've generated excitement, but it's around pricing and the pricing model you guys have. I think you made it pretty simple. I mean, do you want to quickly speak to that? Because we have only about a minute left.
Yeah, it's really simple. We charge $2 for per user per month. That's what the MSP is going to sell through, and then that's called Evo Standard. And then we have Evo Pro, which is $8. That's what we sell to the MSP. It's per user. Right now, we're giving away Evo Pro for free, most cases, and so yeah, I mean, we priced it pretty nicely, and that way that they can, you can make margins, healthy margins on top of what we're doing. So as we add more functionality later. We'll probably introduce Evo Plus, which will have more stuff and be a little bit more expensive than $2, but that's where we're starting for now as we go to market.
I like the simplistic model, which I think service providers can absolutely get their heads around. And to the point you made on, I think it was the third slide or so, that's a small price to pay when the average ransomware attack is now what, $250,000, I think is what you said there. So I think it's absolutely relevant to use these types of services. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've kept this slide up. I hope everybody has jotted down, how they can get a hold of us. We want to be connected with you guys. So please feel free to email Mike and his team. Email us at the Domote site if you guys have more questions. Mike, I want to say I really appreciate your time. I think this was well received. I look forward to the feedback that we get from all of our listeners on this, and let's plan on staying in touch. I look forward to more working closely together with you guys and building in these integrations.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun, and I do too. Yeah, we're really excited to work with you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.